Hey class, so now that we've covered the basics of the endocrine system and we've introduced ourselves to the many hormones that are produced and or secreted by the hypothalamus and pituitary, flag top, we can cover the rest of the endocrine glands and their hormones in this final chunk. We're going to start by thinking not about the endocrine system, but about the skeletal system. Recall this image or something very similar in which we're showing the different types of bone cells. And so we have, let me get my pen out here, these osteoprogenitor cells, which give rise to most of the bone cells, turning into these osteoblasts. And remember, the B in blast is like building up bone. You can see here, it's supposed to imply the bone is building up and building up and building up. And eventually those osteoblasts get trapped in the bone, and then they become these mature bone cells called osteocytes. But when it's time to break down some bone, we have these osteoclasts, these modified immune cells that will crush or cut up the bone to release the calcium, which eventually can be used to form, again, some new bone. And this isn't just done to regulate bone density or during healing of fractures and things like that, although it may be done at those times too. But also this is for calcium homeostasis, to regulate calcium levels. So the question is, who signals to these bone cells what to do? Thyroid gland for one. The thyroid gland is near the thyroid cartilage, aka the Adam's apple, right? And so it's near there. It's bilobed and kind of butterfly shaped. You can somewhat see it here, and you'll see it in other images of the thyroid gland. It has two types of cells there. Follicular cells mean they make the follicles. We actually mentioned follicles early in the endocrine system when we talked about follicle stimulating hormone. And we said follicles are cells that protect the developing egg in the ovary. And when I say follicles are cells, really they're balls of cells. So imagine like a tennis ball. The tennis balls are mostly rubber. So all that rubber is, I want you to think of that as like follicular cells. So they just make the ball. And in the case of the thyroid gland, these follicular cells, not only do they make these balls, but they produce a hormone, multiple hormones actually, T3 and T4. They have longer names like triiodothyronine and thyroxine, and you don't have to learn those, maybe in Bio 6, but we'll just call them T3 and T4. The body needs iodine to make those. So if you've ever wondered why in the event of a nuclear disaster or war, you're supposed to take these potassium iodide pills and it can help prevent the radioactivity from getting into your body. That's because of this. That's because these cells need iodine. And if you can take these pills and fill up the thyroid with some safe iodine before everything becomes irradiated, your body is less likely to develop tumors from that. So just a side note. T3 and T4. So what do these hormones do? Well, they control your metabolism. So metabolism is not a word you want to be scared of. You want to try to embrace it and just realize, like, if you've heard of anabolic steroids, they build up muscle. So anabolism means to build. Catabolism is to break down. And metabolism is just all the building up and breaking down that your body's constantly doing in all the cells all the time. So we're just, metabolism is just all that activity. So pretty important job for T3 and T4. Later in life, especially for females, there can be a tendency for thyroid problems, meaning people might feel like really exhausted and hot and sweating and things like that. And that can be due to thyroid issue. And there's some medicines that can be taken to kind of balance out T3 and T4 levels so your body's not like ramping up its metabolism when it doesn't need to. Around the follicles, there are other cells called parafollicular cells. Where's my pointer? So in between the follicles, like here and here, and I know you can't see this great, but Anywhere you don't see a follicle, one of these cut open balls, those are parafollicular cells, and they're making calcitonin, or as I like to call it, calcibonin, okay? Because it puts the calcium in the bone. Calcibonin puts calcium in bone. So where is the calcium not? If it's in the bone, it's not in the blood. So it lowers blood calcium. Takes some of that circulating blood calcium in the blood, and it puts it in the bone, calcibonin. That's what calcitonin does. That's not the only way to set aside calcium, right? You can put it in your bone, or you can just get rid of it. So calcitonin will also tell the kidneys to pee out some of that extra calcium. Sometimes you want to get rid of extra calcium or maybe sequester it, set it aside in the bone, save it for later. But when later comes and you need more calcium, then we get into the parathyroid gland. So it's going to have the opposite effect of the thyroid gland's hormone called calcitonin. The parathyroid gland, there's actually 4-ish, you may have a little more, masses or chunks of tissue. They're on the back of the thyroid gland, so kind of embedded inside the thyroid gland, but they're separate organs, and they make parathyroid hormone. Pretty straightforward name. And in this case, we're going to increase blood calcium. So we're going to do the opposite. We're going to increase blood calcium. Maybe one thing you could do is tell the osteoclast to cut up a bunch of bone and release the calcium into the blood. Or tell the kidneys to quit peeing so much out. Save it. Keep it in the blood. There's more calcium in the blood. And one last option is that you can tell the intestines, look, fellas, we really need some calcium here, okay? So I need you to pick up the pace and really absorb all the possible calcium out of the food. So 3 ways to increase blood calcium. And it says here doing the opposite effect of the thyroid gland, more specifically, opposite effect of calcitonin in the thyroid gland. Remember, 2 jobs for the thyroid gland. One has to do with calcium, one has to do with metabolism. And now the suprarenal glands. That's probably the only time I'll call them that. But many sources are trying to encourage us to rename them suprarenal glands. Also, if you've ever heard of adrenaline, that's gone bye-bye as well. Now we call it epinephrine. So a little bit of tidying up in our anatomy language is always kind of happening. But the suprarenal glands, or you can call them the adrenal glands, the key word here is renal, meaning kidney. So these sit above or on top of the kidneys. There's 2, one on each kidney, kind of shaped like pyramids. And structurally, they're 2 glands in one, meaning if you dissected them out, they're pretty much separate glands, each glob. And their functions totally different also. So you kind of want to just picture these as each adrenal gland is really 2 glands. The medulla on the inside, we mentioned earlier when we talked about the different ways we control hormone release. One way was neural control, and that's how things are released from the adrenal medulla, through neural control. So if you want the adrenal gland to release epinephrine and the closely related norepinephrine, the hypothalamus is going to send these neurons down and zap it and tell it when to release those hormones. And those get released during fight or flight situations. So we're talking, let's say in the most extreme case, right? Saber-toothed tiger brought back by mad scientists attacks you, and what do you need to do to run away or to fight? You got to increase your heart rate so you can pump blood faster to your skeletal muscle. And you can increase your blood pressure to help get that blood there. But the blood's not going to help unless there's oxygen in it, so you increase your respiration rate too. Your basal metabolic rate increases. In fact, we can name 15 other changes during a fight or flight situation, like sweating and pupil dilation, but we're going to save that for when we do the nervous system stuff. But here are just a few basic things that will happen due to epinephrine flooding through your body. The adrenal cortex is the outer part of the adrenal gland, not this middle medulla part. The outer part is the adrenal cortex, and we'll look at the next slide and see that the cortex is made of a few different layers. The capsule here is just a protective connective tissue layer. The medulla, we already talked about, that has to do with epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the remaining 3 layers make up the adrenal cortex, or I should call them the remaining 3 zones. Zone number 1, the most superficial zone, zona glomerulosa. So zona glomerulosa, a glomerulus is like a ball-shaped structure, or a globe, let's say a globe-shaped structure. So in this zone, as you can see best in this cartoony version of this drawing, they're little kind of round structures. Tough to make out in the histology, but they're there. In this area, the adrenal cortex makes a type of hormone called a mineralocorticoid, called aldosterone. So corticoid, don't be afraid of that. That just means in the cortex. And the hormone is doing something with minerals. And as you can read, it says it's acting on the kidneys to affect how they save or not minerals, mainly like sodium and potassium. So aldosterone is a type of hormone acting on the kidneys to affect mineral retention. Zona fasciculata, well, a fascicle is like a long, skinny fiber, like we talked about in the muscle chapter. So this zone has these long fibers, and the hormones made here are called glucocorticoids. So they're made in the cortex, and they have something to do with glucose, sugar. A specific hormone is cortisol. So cortisol is a type of glucocorticoid releasing sugar as part of a long-term stress response. I'm talking about longer than the saber-toothed tiger attack, right? Where we needed epinephrine. I'm saying like worrying about the next exam for several weeks, or maybe in, more realistic and sad cases like long bouts of domestic violence or abuse. You have these glucocorticoids that they're trying to help deal with the stress. They're releasing all of this glucose, sugar, and making all these other physiological changes to your body to try to beat this stressor. They don't know if it's like a psychological thing, a societal effect. They're just freeing up this sugar, and that can cause a lot of problems in the body. Zona reticularis, retic, means net-like. So in this kind of maybe somewhat net-like layer, we have a type of hormone being made called the gonadocorticoid. In the cortex, it has something to do with the gonads. So sex hormones are being made here. Great news, if you are a genetic male or a genetic female, you have adrenaline and estrogen in your body. Yeah? I mean, both. Because even if you don't have any testes, as long as you've got adrenal glands, you're making a bit of testosterone. And for males, even without ovaries, there is this estrogen production happening. So that's thanks to these adrenal glands. All right, we're getting down to the last couple here. Pancreas, remember from the top of the chapter, it's both an exocrine gland and an endocrine gland. So the exocrine part of the pancreas are these acini cells that make digestive enzymes. But we're here to talk more about the pancreatic islets, also known as islets of Langerhans. These islets, or little islands, are the endocrine part. So if we look at the histology of the pancreas, there's all these cells all over the place here. Those are just like doing that exocrine function. But this little island in the middle, that's what's involved in the endocrine system. What kind of hormones is it making? Glucagon and insulin. So what do? Well, remember way back in the day talking about dynamic equilibrium? this like homeostatic goal of trying to maintain your blood sugar around a set point, but we're constantly always going up a little or down a little or up a little or down a little. So that's glucagon and insulin are causing those ups and downs. Glucagon increases blood sugar levels by breaking down glycogen in the liver. That's where you're storing glucose kind of short term as glycogen in the liver. You can just process that real quick and free it up. Insulin, though, decreases blood glucose levels by helping the cells pull the glucose in to make use of it. So when you get into physiology, you'll talk more about the different types of diabetes, how they're caused. You'll circle back plenty to why someone might carry not just insulin, but even glucagon to help them regulate their blood sugar levels. And the pineal gland, small little gland found inside the brain, little tiny thing. Don't confuse it with the pituitary gland, because that's a real major gland. Pineal gland just hanging out off the roof of this third ventricle, this structure we'll learn about with the nervous system. It makes melatonin, which helps regulate the sleep-wake cycle. Now, if you're staring at your phone all the time, you're talking to the pineal gland, because the pineal gland does get input from your visual pathways. So you can mess up the secretion of melatonin and jack up your sleep-wake cycle, right? That's why the phones now have these different settings to try to change the light and help prevent this. So it's a pretty important gland, easily confused with the pituitary gland, because along with the hypothalamus, those are all the parts of the brain that are involved in the endocrine system. Oops, a couple more. Thymus, real quick and straightforward. It's in this deep to the sternum. It sits just basically on top of the heart. See the heart there? And then the thymus is on top. It's big when you're young, especially around puberty. This is when your body's learning to fight off a lot of diseases. It's very active. But in adults, it's pretty much gone. It's becomes a lot of connective tissue and fat and not a ton else. But you do need it to hang around and do its job, because it makes a hormone called thymosin. Pretty good name for the thymus, makes thymosin, which you need to develop your lymphocytes. We'll talk more about that in the lymphatic chapter. Finally, gonads. Testes and ovaries are both gonads. The ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. We'll talk more about during the reproductive system. Those are kind of linking up the ovarian and uterine cycles. You really want to make sure that when the egg ovulates from the ovary, that the uterus is prepared for maybe implantation of a fertilized egg. So these hormones help those two communicate. If a fertilized egg does get implanted, you need to tell the ovary to quit sending new eggs. So they got to talk this way and back that way, and then this way and back that way. These ovaries also, these hormones, estrogen and progesterone, also lead to the development of secondary sexual characteristics. Stuff that's not present at birth, right? So like a newborn female will have certain genitalia and uterus and structures that are already going to be there. But over time, a female will develop additional features. Those are secondary sex characteristics. We'll come back to it in a second. We'll just name the male gonads, testes. They make testosterone, and of course they make sperm. The testes make sperm. Again, testosterone is going to make secondary sex characteristics. Stuff that's not present at birth. It's not going to make a penis grow or testes grow, but let's talk about some of these secondary sex characteristics. Because I'm a genetic male, I'm going to start this from a more male bias, but I'll say that the testosterone I began to secrete more in or at puberty led to the growth of facial hair, the growth of the thyroid cartilage, and accompanying vocal changes, increased muscle mass, greater stature. And some things that it didn't do that would be active in females would be like enlarging of the hips, breast development. Females have slightly longer arms, which is fun. If you find a female of your same height, if you're a male, then you can test this out. Generally, their arms are like 2 to 3 centimeters longer, and their elbows can hyperextend farther. Just fun little anatomical quirks that I'm not sure if they've determined some kind of function for those. But think through these. You could probably come up with a few more secondary sex characteristics. We'll revisit in reproduction, but you really want to understand those now because they are a huge part of these reproductive hormones. So that's the end of the endocrine system. Hope you enjoyed it. It's good stuff.